As the Third Reich's army swept across Europe, they built ghettos to round up, fence in, and starve millions of Jewish people. Behind the high walls and barbed wires lay endless suffering, as well as fervent resistance. Despite the starvation, the sickness, the crowding, the rising horror, the ghetto's inhabitants organized underground armies. They smuggled guns through sewers, mapped escape routes, and reached out to partisans hiding in nearby forests. They knew what kind of monster they faced. They understood they had little chance of surviving, but they refused to make it easy for the enemy to simply destroy them. Sometimes, resistance meant fighting. Other times, it meant refusal to participate in the Third Reich's war machine. Sometimes, resistance was merely a final act of control in a world designed to strip Jews of all agency. These are not happy stories, but they are inspiring tales of defiance and resilience. So, what happened inside 3 ghettos where Jews refused to go quietly? In the Lachwa Ghetto, the simple act of surviving each day demanded unimaginable strength. 2,300 Jews were crammed into a handful of city blocks, living off of scraps of bread. To keep the residents trapped and powerless, the ghetto was sealed off in April 1942, with armed Belarusian guards stationed around the perimeter to stop anyone who dared to escape. As in every ghetto, the Nazis forced Lachwa's Jews to form a Judenrat, a council of respected Jewish figures responsible for running daily operations in the ghetto. Some hoped the role might let them protect their families or fellow Jews, but their responsibilities went far beyond handing out meager food rations. The councils were part of the Nazis' sadistic, calculated plan to destroy Jewish communities from within, turning ordinary people against one another. When the Nazis demanded deportations, the Judenrat had to compile lists of their own neighbors. When the Nazis ordered forced labor, the Judenrat were responsible for gathering and sending workers. Most of the time, they didn't dare refuse. Their families' lives were on the line. The Judenrat faced a constant, agonizing guessing game. Should they obey in hopes of keeping their people safe? Or should they resist, knowing they were putting thousands of people in the crosshairs? As word spread of slaughters in surrounding towns, the Judenrat of Lachwa came to a grim realization. No one would survive by simply obeying orders. Lachwa's young men began organizing an underground resistance, led by H0locaust, a Zionist activist. The underground reached out to local partisans for weapons, but many refused to help Jews, treating them as enemies rather than allies, despite their shared foe. So the Judenrat took matters into their own hands. Led by Dov Lopatin, another former Zionist group leader, they smuggled in axes, knives, iron bars, and grenades, slipping them past guards and hiding them in secret caches. Whatever horrors lay ahead, the Jews of Lachwa were determined to fight back. By the summer of 1942, those horrors came knocking. The Jews of Lachwa awoke one morning to see local farmers digging massive pits along the riverbank. Rumors of liquidations in nearby ghettos had already reached them. Here was the evidence of their own imminent liquidation, the mass grave yawning before them. Panic swept through the ghetto. Rufeisen immediately began drafting a plan for uprising, but Lopatin urged caution, determined to learn exactly what the Nazis had planned. It wasn't good news. The ghetto was indeed about to be liquidated, its streets emptied by force. The thousands of Jews living there would be deported or shot. The Nazis offered Lopatin a terrible choice: comply with the orders, and they would spare the members of the Judenrat and 30 artisans of Lopatin's choosing. It was a tempting deal, and another leader might have accepted. Not Lopatin. He returned to the underground insisting, either we all survive or we all perish. On the morning of September 2nd, 1942, the Nazis marched into Lachwa, prepared to deport or wipe out the entire Jewish population. As the soldiers advanced, Lopatin set fire to the Judenrat headquarters. This was the signal. The resistance sprang to life. Members of the underground started torching the ghetto. Flames devoured the buildings. Smoke choked the streets. With the Nazis caught off guard, hundreds of Jews sprinted through the inferno to escape. Meanwhile, Jewish fighters rushed at the Nazi and Belarusian guards with their smuggled weapons. Lopatin was wounded in the hand, but managed to escape into the forest. By early afternoon, the underground had taken down 6 German soldiers and 8 Belarusian policemen. Though nearly 1,000 Jews had managed to break through the ghetto's borders, hundreds were shot or caught as they ran, while others perished in the flames. In total, the uprising claimed 1,500 Jewish lives. But roughly 600 made it to the surrounding forests. At least 120 of them lost their lives before they could reach the partisans, some hunted down by the Nazis, others betrayed by local farmers. By the end of the war, only 90 of Lachwa's escapees were still alive. Despite these paltry numbers, each survivor was a miracle. Those 90 people would surely have been shot along with everyone else and tossed into a mass grave had they not run. The Lachwa Ghetto shatters the myth that the Judenrats were just puppets of Nazi control. The fighters of Lachwa were under no pretenses. They knew that most of them wouldn't make it out alive, but they realized quickly that they would likely perish regardless of what they did. At least this way, they would go out on their own terms. The Jews of Lachwa didn't have many weapons, only unity and the will to fight. In the face of annihilation, their unity became their greatest weapon. Choosing to fight became their final act of defiance. And the miraculous survival of the 90 fighters showed clearly that Jews refused to be erased. Resistance didn't always come with weapons. Sometimes it meant calculating the right moment to run, knowing that one misstep would spell doom. The 2,400 Jews of Mir were no strangers to the horrors of the Reich. In July 1941, barely a month after seizing the town, soldiers rounded up the town's prominent members, most of whom were Jews, and shot them in a nearby forest. The message was clear. The Nazis were in charge now. The Nazis then formed the First Ghetto in Mir, forcing thousands of Jews into the handful of houses that had survived the invasion. Though there were no fences or guards, life inside the ghetto was a daily nightmare. As many as 20 people were packed into a single room. Grueling forced labor sapped every ounce of energy. The Jews of Mir were forced to scrape icy streets, mend broken roads, and shovel snow in winter, fueled by nothing more than scraps of bread. But that was only a small taste of the cruelty to come. On November 5th, 1941, the Nazis ordered Mir's Jews to fork over a massive sum of 250,000 rubles. 4 days later, they dragged roughly 1,500 of the town's Jews out of their houses and shot them in the streets, claiming the ransom hadn't been paid. In a single day, over 2/3 of Mir's Jewish population was wiped out. The survivors barely had time to grieve before the German order police, the Opo, rolled into town. Their job was to manage occupied areas, and they quickly recruited policemen from the surrounding Belarusian villages, tightening control and spreading fear. A few members of Zionist youth movements could read the writing on the wall. If they wanted even a chance of survival, they had to do something. Secretly, they began organizing an underground resistance. But dangers were everywhere, including right next door. Local non-Jewish partisans refused to assist the young Jewish fighters. Some even betrayed them. Unlike in Lachwa, Mir's Judenrat opposed plans of an armed uprising. They feared that if the Nazis discovered the rebels, the ghetto inhabitants would pay with their lives. Still, the Judenrat didn't actively stop the resistance. Instead, they attempted to bribe local Nazi and Belarusian officials with whatever valuables they had left, hoping to shield the ghetto from destruction. With neighbors ready to betray them at the slightest hint of rebellion, and Nazi oppression tightening like a noose around the town, the Jews of Mir had no good foothold from which to resist. But what they did have was a secret weapon by the name of Oswald Rufeisen. Rufeisen was a Jewish man from Western Poland who had arrived in Mir just after the November crackdowns. He used his fluency in German to disguise himself as an ethnic German Pole, and managed to get recruited into the German police as a translator for the Belarusian police chief. On the surface, he blended in seamlessly, joking and drinking with his fellow officers. In secret, he was slipping intelligence to the Jewish underground. It wasn't just information he smuggled. He also became the ghetto's secret arms supplier. Rufeisen would stroll in with a rifle slung over his shoulder, only to somehow leave without it. Under the cover of horse and buggy, he snuck in rifles and ammunition, risking his life with every delivery. But his boldest act was yet to come. By May 1942, Mir's Jewish population had plummeted from 2,400 to only 800. The Nazis forced the remaining Jews into an abandoned castle just outside town. Barbed wire and guarded gates sealed them in on all sides. Now, they were not only trapped, but entirely isolated. Fear hung over the ghetto like a dark cloud. In June, that fear was confirmed when Rufeisen overheard part of a telephone conversation between German officials. The Nazis were planning to liquidate the ghetto on August 13th, deporting or exterminating the entire population. Tension and terror gripped the ghetto. Rufeisen urged his fellow Jews to flee, but many protested. What would happen to the weak, the children, the elderly who couldn't run? Any escape would mean harsh punishments for those left behind. Desperate, the Judenrat tried to buy the ghetto's safety. They bribed the town's Belarusian mayor, begging for protection. They even tried bribing the German police, but it was no use. The SS was determined to liquidate Mir. That night, the Judenrat called a meeting. People prayed, cried, and fasted. A last-ditch effort to get God to intervene. Rufeisen had managed to smuggle in 11 rifles, 6 pistols, and limited rounds of ammunition. But this was a paltry arsenal compared to the SS's weapons. Any fight was doomed to fail. But standing by or merely going quietly was not an option either. The Judenrat was out of options. They had begged and bribed and smuggled in weapons, but it just wasn't enough. If they fought, they were doomed. But maybe there was another way. The head of the Judenrat called together the young people of the ghetto and the members of the resistance. Together, they began crafting a plan to escape. On the night of August 9th, 1942, just 4 days before the ghetto was scheduled to be liquidated, those who had chosen to run gathered near the gates. Earlier, Rufeisen had pulled off a daring distraction, sending the German policemen racing after partisans who didn't exist to buy the escapees precious minutes. Under the cover of darkness, the members of the resistance snipped the barbed wires and helped the ghetto's inhabitants slip through the hole. 200 people crept through and sprinted towards the forests, hearts pounding with fear and hope. Many later joined partisan units, continuing the struggle for survival. 560 Jews remained behind, some by choice, others because they were too sick or old to run. On August 13th, the Nazis rounded them up and shot them, dumping them into mass graves, just as Rufeisen had warned. Over the next few months, the Nazis scoured the forests and towns, hunting down escapees. Non-Jewish locals eagerly aided their search. Within a month, they had hunted down 69 Jews. Just before the ghetto's liquidation, Rufeisen was betrayed, forced to confess, and thrown into prison. But his friendships with local German policemen had paid off. The guard assigned to watch him quietly let him slip away, reporting him only once he had reached a safe distance. Miraculously, Rufeisen survived, along with roughly 50 other people from Mir, 50 out of 2,400. The fate of the Mir Jews is an important reminder that the camps were not the only extermination site. Entire towns became mass graves. The SS was close enough to look their victims in the eye and shoot anyway. The people of Mir had almost no chance of surviving. Defiant, they fought back however they could. Sometimes, resistance doesn't require guns. Sometimes, fleeing is the bravest thing to do. If Lachwa and Mir showed that resistance was possible, Bialystok was the ultimate test. A massive, heavily guarded ghetto where defiance seemed impossible. Within the ghetto, 50,000 Jews were forced to work 12-hour days, producing war supplies and sewing uniforms with barely any food. People wasted away in plain sight, sick, starving, too weak to stand. Still, the Judenrat and much of the ghetto clung to a desperate hope. If they proved themselves essential to the war effort, the Nazis just might allow them to survive. That illusion was shattered in February 1943 with the deportations. In a matter of days, 10,000 men, women, and children were crammed onto trains bound for Treblinka extermination camp, while hundreds more, too sick or weak to move, were shot on the spot. A Jewish underground had already been active in Bialystok, led by various youth movements, but bitter disagreements ripped the groups apart. Some wanted to fight, despite their struggle to gather weapons. Others believed their best shot was to escape and join the partisans in the forests. With no good options, they struggled to form a unified strategy. The divisions became even deeper after the February deportations. Many felt betrayed, frustrated that the underground did nothing to try and stop the deportations. Meanwhile, the Judenrat continued to hold on to hope that productivity would save Bialystok's remaining inhabitants. The underground had struck a fragile agreement with the Judenrat. They wouldn't revolt unless it became clear that the Nazis planned to liquidate the entire ghetto. But they knew they couldn't just sit and wait for the Third Reich to arrive. What could they do when fighting seemed hopeless and escape out of reach? In July 1943, the pressure reached a breaking point when the rumors reached Bialystok of an upcoming liquidation. Fooled by a surge in production orders for the factory, the Judenrat reassured the frightened inhabitants that everything would be okay. Only the underground understood the truth. The time to act had arrived. Just a few months before, the inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto had staged a doomed but surprisingly fierce resistance effort, shocking the soldiers who had rolled into the ghetto with tanks. It took nearly a month for the SS to put down the uprising, a shocking amount of time for starving resistance fighters to hold out against an army. Entire countries had fallen in a matter of days or weeks. Somehow, the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto had managed to outlast Denmark, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia. While most of Warsaw's fighters did not survive, their courage and strength profoundly inspired Bialystok's underground, and the fractured groups finally united under Mordechai Tenenbaum, who had previously helped form a resistance group in Warsaw. He had not been in Warsaw for the uprising, and he was determined to give the Germans hell in Bialystok. Unfortunately, the example of Warsaw went both ways. It inspired the resistance, but it also taught the Germans how to anticipate and crush a revolt. On August 15, 1943, the Gestapo told the head of the Judenrat that the ghetto's workers would be transported to work in Lublin the next day. Shocked, but trusting the order, he failed to warn the underground. By 2 a.m. the next morning, the underground discovered the ghetto surrounded by armed soldiers and armored vehicles. They scrambled to form a plan. 200 men and women gathered the few weapons they had, a handful of battered rifles and grenades. Female couriers rushed through the ghetto streets, posting leaflets urging their fellow Jews not to surrender, to take up the fight for their lives. But still comforted by the Judenrat's reassurance, thousands of Bialystok's Jews lined up the next day, believing they'd be transported to work in Lublin. Realizing their numbers would be far smaller than expected, the underground abandoned plans for hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they began hurling grenades. Most of the resistance was wiped out within the first morning, though the fighting raged for days. 72 fighters held out in a bunker beneath the ghetto, only to be discovered, dragged out, and shot. Before he could be caught, their leader Tenenbaum and his right-hand man took their own lives. Despite the devastating losses, over 100 Jews did manage to escape, fleeing into the forests to join partisan groups. Among them was H0locaust, who had helped organize the resistance movements in Vilna, Warsaw, and Bialystok. It had been Heike who negotiated with the head of the Judenrat in Bialystok, persuading him to look the other way when the underground began organizing. Heike was one of Bialystok's few survivors, and she spent the rest of her life serving the Jewish people. But the uprising and the story of H0locaust shows that resistance was possible, even in places designed to crush any hope of rebellion. Despite their impossible choices and harsh disagreements, rival groups managed to pool their resources and coordinate an uprising. The fighters of Bialystok knew the odds were against them, and they chose resistance anyway, refusing to submit quietly to annihilation. Across Europe, Jews faced impossible odds, gnawed by starvation, crushed by exhaustion, weakened by disease and despair. They had few options. Their neighbors betrayed them. Their fellow partisans abandoned them. And yet, even trapped within a machine designed to annihilate them, they resisted, armed and unarmed, individual and collective. They planned, organized, stockpiled weapons. They couldn't control the outcome, but they could control their response. Their story remains an example and an inspiration to us all.